It's good to see friends in the room here. Former Mayor Liggett over there from Marshall County was a member of our association for a long time, and I would bet that we've probably, can't see y'all real well with the lights, but we've probably got some county commissioners and other folks here in the room, because I know Farm Bureau does a tremendous job, not only of engaging in what you all do and the services you provide to our nation and keep us all literally alive. Providing the food that goes on our tables. But so many, your organization also give you great props for the work that you do in educating kids around things with civics, the work that happens through like the FFA programs and some of those that are teaching them about government, about civics, and how to do Robert's Rules of Order and things like that that you don't really hear taught anywhere else. So very appreciative for that, and so many of you all who serve in your governments. Let's see if I can get this clicker working. I said I was on a call with some other directors of county associations from different states back in March. And in particular, this was one called related to COVID-19 very early on. And the state directors from both Washington State and New York State, which, as you all probably remember, were two of the places with some of the earliest impact. They were on that call. And they told us back then, they're like, get ready, because you cannot underestimate how this is going to impact your community. They're like, it is going to eat up every bit of your time. You're going to be dealing with questions and issues that you've never heard of before. Your officials are going to be struggling with questions and issues they've never heard of before, and this is going to change your world. A little bit later after that, we began to see how that was true. So just a few things I'm going to run through and talk about today. Some of it is about the impact of COVID-19 on our local communities and on county government. Talk a little bit about the health overall, economic health of counties, and what we're seeing in terms of both consumer spending, unemployment, a number of issues like that. And then talk some about what's going on with your local governments. I know in particular you all have an interest in that. As some of the largest landowners, you're very sensitive to what happens with property taxes, and I'm sure you're concerned about that, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So for a timeline, if you think back to what all happened, and the information I've got in my presentation today, most of this comes from either the CDC, a little bit of it's coming from the Department of Revenue, or actually the Boyd Center for Business and Economic Research up at UT Knoxville as well. And that's where this is coming from. I know there's people out there that have all sorts of different feelings about what's going on in our country and what the truth is about what's going on in our country. We've got folks in our membership that see it very, very different ways. But I'm just going to try to stick with some of the things that we know have fallen on our county government's plates and how they're trying to deal with them. December 31st was back when China first started reporting about a strange cluster of cases of pneumonia in the Wuhan province. By January 7th, they associated that with what they call a new novel coronavirus, and we all heard a word that we've probably never heard before, and then in the time since then, you've probably heard it every single day of your life. January 19th, we got the first reported cases in Washington State here in the United States. By January 30th, we were up to about 10,000 cases in the U.S. and 21 worldwide, and it was in 21 countries. As of now, here in August, according to figures, this is actually from the World Health Organization, they're estimating about 20 million cases worldwide, and it's in over 200 countries. Virtually every country you've ever heard of has this. In the U.S., there's a little over 5 million cases. It's in all 50 states, D.C., and most of the territories as well. So this is something, unlike some of the other outbreaks we've had, SARS or Ebola or things like that, they were limited as far as their reach in terms of how far they got. But this spread all over the world and did it pretty much overnight. So according to the CDC, there have been, as of yesterday, 5,119,711 cases in the U.S. States range from a low of 1,478 in Vermont to a high of over 570,000 in California. And we've registered over 160,000 deaths related to this. Looking at these figures, if you think about that, and this is just dividing 163,000 into the 5 million, that's about a 3.2% mortality rate nationwide. Keep that in mind because it's very interesting when we get to the numbers in Tennessee. Our numbers are very different there, and we'll talk about that in a minute. If you're like me, when we start talking in these numbers of like 160,000 deaths or 5 million cases and everything like that, I don't have a context to place that in. So I looked up some things about this, and the last year in which the CDC reports generally about causes of death in the United States, they've got complete figures for 2017. So just wanted to kind of place this in the context of what we see in the rest of our world and why this has raised concern. So anybody want to guess out there, and this is not such a great, fun, interactive activity, but anybody want to guess what the leading cause of death is in the United States? You can shout it out if you want. Somebody said heart disease right up here up front. That's number one. You want to guess number two? Can't. You might be able to see a little bit on the screen. I can't tell if or not. Yeah, cancer is number two. Accidents, number three. That could be automobile. That could be all kinds of different accidents. Chronic lower respiratory symptoms, things like emphysema, COPD, other issues like that. Strokes, Alzheimer's, diabetes. Then we get influenza and pneumonia is the ninth, and or eighth. Nephritis or kidney disease is the ninth. Suicide's the 10th. So that's the top 10 causes of death in the United States. So where does COVID fall in on that? If you start looking at this, the U.S. experiences about 47,000 suicides a year, about 50,000 people die of kidney disease, 55,000 in that particular year of influenza and pneumonia, and that does change from year to year depending on the strain of flu. 83,000 diabetes, 121,000 Alzheimer's, 146,000 stroke, 160,000 from respiratory issues, accidents, 169,000. So as of right now, with COVID being in the United States for around 6 months, it has now become, it's about to pass accidents to become the third leading cause of death in our country. I didn't realize this until we started pulling some of this together and started looking at these issues. And I think that's why people are studying this and trying to figure out how on earth do we get a handle on it. Cancer's almost 600,000, heart disease over 600,000. If COVID ends up becoming as widespread as the flu does, based on the mortality rate, it's going to be up there rivaling heart disease and cancer for one of the leading causes of death in the entire country. And there's a tremendous personal impact, a tremendous loss on that, a tremendous loss of human life, but also tremendous economic impacts of that. If suddenly overnight we've had something show up in our country that becomes a third leading cause of death. Someone else I was on a call with early on in all this talked about how, you know, the goal with this and the things that we're trying to do when we had shutdowns early on, when we've had mask requirements or we've had the different things that we've had, it's never been to put an end to this and nobody else gets COVID. It's going to be out there and we know there's going to be cases, but it was about how do we manage those, how do we deal with the surge of cases so that they don't overwhelm our healthcare system and our hospitals, and how do we deal with this thing? Well, I said it wasn't really until I saw the context as to how this relates to the number of deaths generally in the United States to see how big of a significant impact it is. In Tennessee, the first case showed up in Williamson County, and then Davidson County, Shelby County became hot spots. As you all know, those two communities have over 20,000 cases that have been confirmed there. Early on, we saw some outbreaks in prison facilities, and that kind of was a spike where we've got little communities like Lake County and Trousdale County that only have 5,000 or 6,000 residents in those counties, but they have almost 800 cases in Lake County and over 1,500 in Trousdale County, but it's almost all centered in prison facilities. And the interesting thing, when they discovered those outbreaks and they went in and tested, the vast majority of those people were asymptomatic. And that, because this was breaking out in a number of different places, the state went out and started testing virtually everybody that was in a state prison facility. And through that process, they did find a number of other cases. But again, the strange thing was many of those folks were asymptomatic. So Tennessee's had a little over 125,000 confirmed cases, but we've only had a little over 1,200 deaths. So if you look at that, that's much closer to 1%. And whereas we have a nationwide or a worldwide mortality rate that's closer to 3. So why is that? I wish that we could say it's because we're all such healthy people, but I mean, the truth is we know that. Tennessee's got a high rate of diabetes, it's got a high rate of heart disease, and a number of those other factors that tend to be things which make it more likely for a person to have a very difficult time with COVID. I think what's going on is our state really did get organized early to try to get out there and do testing and make testing available. There's certainly been times, I had a neighbor who got tested right before the 4th of July weekend, and it took her like 12 days to hear back. There have been times there were delays and it was difficult, but I know our state has really been about trying to get testing done as rapidly as they can and for as many people as possible. So I think that has to play a role in this, is that our state is discovering many more people who are asymptomatic who are carrying it. That will help with contact tracing. That will help with breaking down that asymptomatic spread of the disease. But that's something to watch, because I said nationwide we're about 16th in population out of the 50 states. We're about 13th on the number of cases we have, but we're down like 25th or 26th in the number of deaths. So there's good news in that, but it's a little bit, I think, I think it's caught up to some degree in the fact that we're doing more testing than other places are. Working with county governments, I watched this early on as we saw cases going up, and it's been almost a routine part of my life for the last few months. Every day at 2 o'clock, I know the Department of Health is releasing the new figures, and they're coming out, and you can see how counties are impacted, and you can see how the state as a whole is impacted. It eventually spread to all 95 counties. Hancock County, do we have anybody from Hancock here? They were the last ones to get a case. But then they had something that showed up and it spread, and they've got over 60 or 70 cases, maybe up close to 80 cases now in another very small rural community. And where we are now, that's these figures. There's only 10 counties now that have had less than 100 cases of COVID. So it's every county in the state, and it's becoming a substantial population in just about every county in the state. And we've got 21 counties now with over 1,000 cases. So the state and local response. This has been interesting, and it's been a challenge to the work that I do with counties, and it's been a challenge to county government. It's been a challenge to state government. On March the 12th, Governor Lee issued Executive Order 14, which was his first executive order related to this. And then after that, we'll get into that in a minute, he's now up to Executive Order 55, and almost all of those have related in some way to COVID. So it's been a strange thing for state and local government to have so many actions being, so many actions being taken through the process of an executive order. Governors Bredesen and Haslam, in 8 years in office combined, I mean, they only had about 75 executive orders during an 8-year term of office. And we've already had over 40 this year issued by Governor Lee. So they've been trying to do things to address that. The General Assembly, I remember this because our organization is similar to yours. We try to have days on the Hill. We shared some of your pain this year, and that our day on the Hill was scheduled for March 2nd and 3rd, which if you remember, that's when the tornado hit Nashville. So we had folks in town at the Doubletree Hotel, and overnight the power went off and tornado tore through downtown Nashville. The legislature was closed, our breakfast was canceled, and everything fell apart. A little bit later than that, I can remember this, I'm sure Stefan does as well. 1 week, the General Assembly on a Thursday was getting ready to go home for the weekend, and they were talking about how, we're taking care of this, we're not panicking over COVID, we're going to be back next week, and we're proud that we're hosting Farm Bureau. You guys were coming in that very next week. If there's folks here from Lincoln County, the previous week I'd been at Lincoln County Day and had one of your hamburgers that we always appreciate you bringing in. But so that was a Thursday. We're going home, but we're coming back Monday. Things are going to be fine. By the time we got into the weekend, you started hearing changes. And by the time Monday rolled around, it's like, we're shutting this thing down. We're going to pass a bare bones budget and get out of here as quickly as we can, and we're going to close the building to outsiders. So it happened that quickly. So they did come back in March the 20th. They recessed with that bare bones budget in place. April the 2nd was when Governor Lee issued the stay-at-home order. And I've heard a lot of folks talk about that. Particularly, I think you may think this and you may feel this way. A lot of our county officials do. That they're like, back in April, we shut the whole state down. And they're like, at that time, we had 5 cases in our county. I knew who they all were. And there were some people who'd been on a trip and they got sick and they had to stay home. But that was not a problem. And why did we close all of our businesses? And why did we go through what we did? And so later on, I think that's made it more difficult now as we've moved into this new era, and now we've got growth in a lot of places we didn't have it before. And some of those rural counties are now dealing with outbreaks, and it's tougher to put everything back in the box. We've opened the economy up. We wanted to get going again. People were frustrated with staying at home. I feel the pain of those folks. I feel the pain of our county officials who are trying to make those decisions and figure out what they're doing and how to keep things safe in their community. No one has had good answers to this. I'll just say that up front. I mean, it's something new we haven't seen before, and people are trying to find their way through it. And it's like if we need to get the economy open, but if we open it up too quickly and then all this stuff spreads again, people are going to get scared. And whether the economy's open or not, they may not go out. Same thing with schools. We're trying to figure out, can we get the kids in school buildings together safely without it spreading between families? And we've got some school systems that are going online, some that are doing both, some that are doing it in person, and it's been a challenge to figure out how they're going to handle that. But at the same time, a lot of these kids, I mean, I'm lucky that mine are teenagers. My son's been doing online classes for last week, and he can jump on there and do that. He's used to hanging out on a computer. I don't imagine how you do that with an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old or a kindergartner for that matter. So there are challenges we're facing there. But like I said, this changed our world in a lot of different ways, and it continues to do so. Something I'll throw out there. You've probably heard this a lot in the news about how there are 89 counties for which there's a certain set of rules being laid down. We have 95 counties in Tennessee, as you all know. 6 of them have been treated differently through a lot of this. This was something we discovered early on, and I think it's our organization has been talking about taking a look at our emergency management statutes and our procedures that are in place for local government. I think they work really well when you have something like a tornado or a flood or a fire. Something happens in a part of the county, the governor has executive orders, can declare a disaster. Those local county mayors can declare disasters in certain parts of the county, and you can get areas evacuated. You can get extra resources in there. You can get mutual aid from the surrounding counties and clear the roads and wipe things out and get them in order and help recover for a bad storm or a flood or a tornado. Something like this we've not experienced in any of our lifetimes, and to have an ongoing pandemic, which at one point, as I understand, was the only time in the history of our country we've ever had emergencies declared in all 50 states at the same time. And we've got it declared in all across Tennessee. So we're trying to deal with this, and we're trying to manage things that's dragged on for months and months and months. Typical county mayor, if they want to issue an executive order, they can do that for a 7-day period at a time. So early on, when they started doing some of that and putting some things in place or changing the way the courthouse may operate, and maybe you couldn't come see somebody in person there, they had to issue those orders and renew them every week. We found out something different when it comes to quarantines and pandemics and health departments. Out of the 95 counties out there, 6 of them have what we call more independent health departments, in which they have their own medical staff in-house, and they've got a licensed doctor who is designated to be the medical officer for that county. That person under state law is given authority to issue things like quarantine orders. So when you saw Nashville and you saw Shelby County and you saw some of the other large urban counties begin putting in place stay-at-home orders or closing the bars or closing restaurants, they had the authority to do that because there was a medical officer on staff within their own health department. The other 89 counties didn't have a person designated into that position, and so they were dependent upon the regional offices of the State Department of Health. They had to go to those offices to try to get directives on how they need to handle things. And that is where we ended up with circumstances where the governor saying, we're going to set out a set of rules that are going to apply to those 89 counties that don't have independence, and then the other 6 counties do have independence. That created a lot of angst among our members. I think it did out in the public. I think it created a lot of confusion in the news because you would have, I'll say for instance, Knox County, they issued certain orders and things went into place. Sevier County, right near there, Gatlinburg, Pigeon Forge, all of that, as tourists began coming back, they started looking at this and they're like, well, why don't you order masks or why don't you do something? And they're like, we don't have that authority. And people didn't understand what the differences were. And it really came down to that distinction. Do you have that in-house medical officer who's got the independent authority to make those judgments? So it's not, those 6 weren't the largest 6 by population, and the numbers are on there, but it's, Shelby, Davidson, Hamilton, and Knox are the top 4. But then beyond that, you got Sullivan County, which is 8th, up where the Tri-Cities are, and Madison County in West Tennessee is 15th. So you had places like Williamson County, where we are right now, they didn't have the independent authority to make some of the same decisions that a Madison County does, even though the population here is probably 3 times as much. So it created a lot of confusion. Currently, right now, we have 24 counties in the state that are mandating face coverings, and mostly that is some of these six. Here in Middle Tennessee, because the governor did then end up later on delegating the authority to county mayors to make a decision about that. And since then, like I said, 24 have done it. Here in Middle Tennessee, a lot of these counties, like where we are right now, they have, the donut counties are dealing with such a growth, a lot of those all issued masks. You have an area in Upper East Tennessee, the Tri-Cities area, where a whole set of counties in that top northeast corner of the state all issued mask mandates together. Even small rural areas like Johnson County, where Mountain City is way up in the corner. And that was because their healthcare system came to them and said, we are starting to see this, and we're concerned about the impact upon our hospitals and their ICU units and how they're going to operate. So we really think this is something that could help control the spread, and if we want you to do that. So there was a group of mayors that went together up there. In West Tennessee, there's similar problems with the hospital there in Jackson. They expanded their ICU capacity, otherwise they would be completely full. So their previous ICU capacity was entirely filled up, and they've expanded that, and that was filling up as well. And those of you who are from West Tennessee know, I mean, that's a center where a lot of people drive in for their health care and to see their hospitals. And so they're trying to talk about how they're impacted by all the surrounding counties out there, that 85%, I think they said, of the COVID patients in the Jackson Hospital were from a county that's outside of Madison County. So that's just a little bit, in case you had heard questions or you were wondering why are we talking about 89 counties and why can some counties do things and others can't. That's the best answer I know to give you for that. So how did this affect our economy? Tennessee's economy was in a tremendous shape in March of this year, 3.3% unemployment statewide. That jumped in April to 15.5%, biggest jump I think ever in the history of the country. May it dropped to 11, June it's down to 9.7. That's the last figures I could get. That's a little bit below the U.S. rate. U.S. is about 11.1%. These figures have been higher than any other time than the Great Depression. The Depression, not the recession we had just a few years ago, but the Depression. So in May, I can get the countywide data, and our counties ranged from a high of 18.5% unemployment in Sevier County in East Tennessee to a low of 7% in Weakley County. But something about in June, as that's changed now, the highest rate is Shelby County. A lot of people have been able to go back to work in Sevier County as they've opened up the park and some things and started getting tourism back up there again. But so in June, the highest rate was in Shelby County, where Memphis is, and the lowest rate was here in Williamson County with 6.7%. That lowest rate in a county right now in Williamson County is higher than the highest rate in a county back in March. That was Clay County up on the Kentucky border. On the Cumberland Plateau. Clay County had 6.2% unemployment in March, and it was the highest rate in the state. The lowest rate in the state right now is higher than that. So we're still seeing struggles with unemployment. And you all know this, that a lot of those programs that were in place are starting to run out, and it's beginning to get tougher on folks and their pocketbooks. State sales tax collections dropped almost 13.5% in May. They rebounded pretty quickly, but they were still down 1.3% in June. I think the numbers are just now coming out, and Commissioner Ely may have talked to you about that earlier today, that I think the state's going to end up hitting its mark. A lot of that is because of some of the boom and the collection of internet sales tax. That was a change in that really has started to reverse some trends where our sales tax base was eroding. Local option sales tax, when the state fell 13.5%, local option dropped a little over 8%, and those local option collections actually were up 2.5% in June. That was the good news for county government. And I think it has a lot to do, as again I said, with internet taxes. But you may be wondering, how on earth does sales tax drop for the state and go up for local government? Because it's on the same purchases. And that's, to a large degree, it is. But there are some differences in how the state and local tax base work. State tax base is a 7% rate usually, but it's lower on groceries. And that rate applies to the full purchase price. So if you go out and you buy a $1,000 car, you pay 7% sales tax on that. If you buy a $100,000 car, you pay 7% on the full amount. So the state sales tax is a lot more sensitive when you hit big downturns like this, or when you've got high unemployment and people start kind of pulling back. They're still going to buy their groceries, they're still going to do their day-to-day shopping, but they're not going to go buy a new car, or they're not going to go buy furniture, or they're not going to buy some of those big items. So the state sees a bigger drop there. Your local option sales tax can go up to a max of 2.75. That stays the same on whether you're buying food in a restaurant or buying food in a grocery store. But that rate only applies to the first $1,600 of a purchase. So at the maximum rate, that means you go buy a car. If it's a $1,600 car, you're paying $44 in local option sales tax. If it's a $16,000 car, you're paying $44 in local option sales tax, and it's capped. So counties and cities don't get hit as hard when you see a reduction in some of those major purchases, and that's why we're seeing the state having a tougher time with its sales tax than counties and cities are. But they're still impacted by that, and certainly if you're a sales tax dependent community, it's out there. So the county tax base, the bulk of county revenues come from property and sales taxes. For most counties, it's about a 70-30 split, property tax being the 70%. That had declined a little bit as we saw some erosion from internet sales tax, and we're hoping with some things that have changed recently and that we're starting to get that collected now, that may help the sales tax rebound. The only county in the state where that's flipped is Sevier County that I've talked about earlier, and you all know they're a very different community in terms of their tourism and their industries up there. So it's the actually only county in the state where there's more sales tax than there is property tax in the county budget. But for the most part, it's property tax is 70% of the budget, sales tax is about 30% in your typical county. So when the first cases started breaking out in the state, the good news for county budgets this past year and closing out the year we just finished was most everybody had already paid your property tax. It becomes delinquent on March 1. So by the time this virus started impacting anywhere and people started losing jobs, anything happened, just about everybody had paid their property taxes, so the counties were okay. And I said, in the sales tax, a lot of communities, we were nervous, and we're watching this thinking that the bottom may just drop out of county budgets and they may absolutely just get devastated. But we think what happened is a lot of those people stayed home. And if instead of maybe driving into a Madison County, if you live in Crockett County, you bought stuff at your local grocery store and you ordered a lot of things online, had it delivered to your house, and now with the laws being in a better place, that sales tax is coming back to Crockett County. So we actually have seen counties experience, a lot of rural counties have experienced growth in their sales tax during this, and they feel themselves to be a little bit healthier financially, which is a surprise. Now, there are areas in the state that are major, sort of like Williamson County here, Madison County in West Tennessee, that are kind of regional shopping hubs. They're getting hit a little bit differently, but surprisingly, it's not been as bad as we thought it was going to be. As I've mentioned with internet sales tax, you probably heard of the Wayfair decision. That decision allowing the states to begin collecting internet sales tax is important for preserving that base. It was really important for county governments in that there were changes when the state implemented this that allowed it to require those online vendors to report where these purchases were going for the first time. Prior to that, there had been a formula in place in the books that kind of dated back to the catalog days of like Land's End or people like that. So if you ordered something out of state and it came in, they just were hopeful those vendors would send the money in. So they just say, send in a flat 2 1/4. That was an option they had, and it got distributed out. And basically, they just layered that on everything else. So it's like whatever your share was of brick and mortar sales tax, you just got a little bit extra that came from those out-of-state sales. When it was just catalogs, it wasn't big. When it became internet, it got pretty huge. And so you can imagine there were a lot of people living in rural communities who were buying things online, and when that sales tax dollar was coming into the state, it was pretty much all going into larger urban areas and big shopping centers, so it wasn't get attributed to the county where you actually lived. That's been corrected now, and we think that's part of what we're seeing that's been a tremendous boon to counties. So June numbers that we've just got, that's the most recent on the local option sales tax, and they would be for May sales. So even when we were still just starting to see the economy reopen, 88 counties were up over the prior year, and 82 of them were up in double digits over the prior year. So county sales tax is holding up. I said property tax we hope will be there. That's going to be a factor this coming year as whether or not unemployment recovers, whether or not people are able to get back to work, whether or not folks are able to pay their bills, pay their mortgage, pay their taxes. So counties may experience a delinquency there that affects property taxes. So far, we haven't seen that. The last real downturn in '07 was related to property tax values, and we had counties that would do a reappraisal, and your property was actually worth less now than it was 5 years ago. So that was a big hit to that side of the tax base, but we're not seeing that here yet. Fuel taxes are something that are going to be impacted. There's less traffic on the roads. When it goes, counties get a percentage of that that's based on a formula, so it's collected at the state. Didn't have anything to do with where the purchase is made, but then those dollars come back to help fund those local highway departments that are repairing the county highways and fixing the bridges and doing all of that. So May collections were down tremendously on gas tax. On the gas tax and motor vehicle, which is diesel, respond a little bit differently. We still had an awful lot of trucking going on out there, so the diesel tax didn't drop as far, but gas tax did. And I can say from working downtown Nashville, there's still, like, the parking garages are virtually empty. A lot of the high rises are still empty, and people are teleworking. And they're going to continue to do that. A lot of these big companies and big businesses and accounting firms and law firms have said do that through the end of the year. So those folks are staying home. They're not driving as much. They're not consuming the gasoline. Now, for year to date, the year on gasoline tax did end up just barely a fraction over, 0.1% up, and that was in a year in which we had the last rate increase from the Improve Act kick in. I'm looking. I think I'm over my time. But I think I've got one or two slides here. Hotel motel tax obviously was also heavily impacted, but that's not as big a portion of a county budget. Alcohol taxes were an interesting thing we saw, and a bright spot in some cases, that apparently when we were all stuck at home during this, people started drinking a lot more. Mixed drink tax, which is collected in restaurants, that revenue dropped out, but the package store or liquor stores, that revenue was up almost $4.5 million for the year. And beer tax collections ended the year down, and I've talked with some folks who work in the malt liquor industry, and it's interesting that I didn't realize this, but for the liquor industry, the big sales time are November to January. Christmas, Thanksgiving, New Year's Eve, all those holiday parties, that's when people sell wine and liquor. For beer, it's Memorial Day or Labor Day to Memorial Day. So over the summer, and everybody's having picnics and parties and 4th of July. As that's been down this year, beer tax revenues have dropped over the summer as well. So some interesting things going on. There's a lot of state relief that's coming down now from to help out counties with the revenue issues. Governor Lee put $200 million in the budget, and the General Assembly passed that back in March to help local governments. Initially, that was going to be used for certain non-recurring purposes, but they ended up, as they got closer and they came back to tweak the budget, they just said, we need to take the limits off of that, and if you need to plug a hole in your budget and you need to make up for lost revenues, that can go wherever you need that to go. So that was a tremendous help to both city and county governments. Now we're starting to see other monies flow down from the feds, but that's got all kinds of strings attached to it, and it's complicated and probably not anything you're that interested in, but there is revenue flowing down to help with some of these issues and address with some of the costs that are out there. There's some of that going as well into our school systems. The governor designated about $50 million in technology grants and another $11 million to help school systems with their reopening plans. That's probably going to get stretched even this year as we go on. I think there's certainly going to be some school systems that find themselves having to do more online than they really were hoping to do or expecting to do, and that's going to be some challenges as we go forward. So I mentioned that those things on the horizon, school reopening and how we handle that. Access to broadband, you all know that in the rural area, that's important both to education and business as well. And we're watching closely to see if this economic recovery holds. If we can continue to move forward and see things rebound and unemployment come down, we'll be okay. I don't know what's going to happen if we have to go back through another shutdown, and that's going to be very challenging. Nobody wants to see that happen, and hopefully we won't have that. But I'm over my time, and I will now stop and turn things over.
Thank you, Mr. Connor. We do have a few questions. The first one is, what do you consider Tennessee's greatest vulnerability financially as you consider our state's financial future?
Interesting question. The thing that I'm most concerned about is, be perfectly honest and not just trying to suck up to a room full of farmers. It's what you all do. I know there were already a lot of challenges in the farming industry, and what's going on with dairy in particular was challenging. Emotionally, this thing hit me the hardest when I would go to the grocery store. And you'd walk in there and you'd go down these aisles and stuff was gone. There wasn't meat in the freezers. There weren't things on the shelves. When you talk about critical infrastructure, this is it in the room. I mean, we can, if we lose broadband, if we lose everything else, we can get by somehow, but if we can't get food on the table, it's difficult. And you started seeing in this how fragile our system is. If it's just a matter of folks getting panicked and rushing to the store and everybody buying dried beans who hadn't cooked dried beans in years and they stuck them in their pantry and don't know what to do with them, people panicked, and we began to see that disruption can happen. I mean, we also know that things happened at some of the processing plants, and it spread quickly. So as far as a general economic vulnerability, I'm most concerned about that. I think there's a lot of things where the federal government's been printing money and passing it down, but if our farms start really struggling and our food production gets interrupted, that's devastating.
Okay. You spent a lot of time in the first part of your talk there talking about COVID. There are a few questions here relating to that. Will the impact of COVID lead to more efforts to save rural hospitals? And will the state work with counties to find ways to reopen and build new hospitals in rural Tennessee in order to deal with the next pandemic, or simply to provide emergency services to rural people who do not have that today?
Yeah, I am with you. I mean, we've been devastated to watch rural hospital after rural hospital close. That's been a challenge. And now we're seeing those places where it's like well, like what I mentioned earlier, Jackson, Madison County, a lot of those people are coming into the Jackson Hospital because there's not the others in the surrounding area, and they need ICU beds. So it's shown another vulnerability that we have. Before we started dealing with this health epidemic, what we used to talk about on the health side at county government was the opioid problem. And that was everywhere out there. And I had hoped maybe there was a way that could be something, and opioid treatment and recovery could be a part of where we may be able to come up with a new business model for rural hospitals where they could get more into some of that and do things. But it's certainly put a strain on that. And there was some money early on that went out to rural hospitals to help shore them up. But so many of them had gotten into a difficult situation. I'm not sure. Now, there were things that just passed this week related to telemedicine and telehealth, and I think it's possible that that may be something that helps the business model for the rural hospital, and that they may not be able to have some of those specialists on staff, but if they become a hub where you can go for those services in your community and get linked up with a doctor in Memphis or in Nashville or in Johns Hopkins or somewhere else for that matter, that may be a way to help our rural hospitals. But I hope we see more of the federal dollars that are available come and flow down to help keep that in place, because it's tough enough when our urban hospitals are dealing with this, and the rurals when they're not there anymore. So there's so many counties where you're going to have to load that person up in an ambulance, take them to another city to get them in that ICU unit.
Okay. And one last question. There was some discussion in the most recent legislative session about the possibility of legislation to require a referendum to approve property tax increases in some circumstances. What are your thoughts about such a proposal?
Probably not popular in this room. That's something our members are opposed to. Property tax, the things that we listed on there that are out there, that's the only thing right now where if a county's got to raise money, they can go to that without having to hold a referendum. So we had some concerns if that limit got put on that, you could find counties in a really tough circumstance where they had to have revenue for some purpose and they couldn't get a referendum passed. And then they just have to start slashing and burning and cutting through the budget. Now, I know that's not popular with everybody, and the idea of like, we'd like to be able to vote on those tax increases. I can understand that sentiment, but I said that our members have hoped that didn't go anywhere. It didn't this last year. because we're concerned about the stability of how counties would be able to respond if they had to in circumstances like this or other times. Now, I said I expect that legislation will come back again, and I said maybe one we have to agree to disagree on, but I think that probably will be coming out there. But I can certainly understand why, for you all as large landowners, property tax is a very sensitive issue. It's part of why we work hard on some things around sales tax and other issues to try to keep that base as strong as we can to help balance things out so that we're less dependent on the property tax.
So thank you, Mr. Connor. And we appreciate you sharing what your association is doing for Tennessee and local governments.